I'm going to paint a portrait now, a study of my friend Barback. I've put him in the corner of the studio in a nice comfortable spot, and I've spent some time arranging the lights around him so that he's lit in an interesting way and so that his features are quite clearly defined. It's incredibly important with portraits to make sure that because you're dealing with somebody, to make sure that they're happy, and also so that if they need a break you can put them back more or less in the position that they started in. So we've set things up so that Barback is looking in a particular direction and his gaze is fixed or anchored to an object which he'll be able to come back to with reasonable ease. Rule number one, remember you're painting a head and keep reminding yourself. A head has a front and a side and a top and a back, and obviously a neck that supports it like a column. And in Barback's case, a very good neck that supports and relates very strongly to the head that it's supporting. So I'm going to start off with very thin paint, and I'm working on a sort of mauve purple ground and in quite warm colours in a very mobile way. So the paint is very loose and very easy to move around and very easy to alter. It's thinned out with turpentine, and everything can be changed. Drawing is about arranging shapes in the right places, getting things where you want them to, and that never stops with painting. So painting is not a distinct and separate thing from drawing. It is absolutely drawing, but drawing with colour and drawing in layers. The process is one of constant revision. As you can see, I'm constantly changing and revising the position of things and the relationship between the things that I'm looking at. So I start with the front of the face and shade in the area that forms the front of his head. So the idea is that I'm trying to get the shapes and the forms in the right places, and I'm working all over my subject. I'm not doing the eye and then doing the other eye and then doing the nose. I'm trying to keep my distance, working with a big brush and working on the big simple shapes that form the structure of the neck and the head and the relationship between those two things. Colour at this stage is all pretty monochromatic. I'm not using lots of colours. I'm using a simple palette, starting with raw sienna, light red and a little cerulean blue to darken things up where I need them dark. I'm keeping the tonal range quite close, so I'm saving my lightest lights and my darkest darks until much later on in the picture. At this stage it's all about getting things in the right place, getting the proportions right, and trying to paint someone who might be a distant relative of Barback's, or at least a human being, and gradually during the course, hopefully, of the process, he will start to look like a slightly closer relation, drift through a state of maybe being a brother, and then, if we're lucky, he'll end up looking something like Barback. Understanding colour involves experimentation. You need to work with different families of colours, see what happens to them when you mix them together, and gradually you will learn what works and what doesn't work. Sometimes people get set on a very particular palette, a very tight and limited range of colours which work for them, but of course it's nice to experiment and to be open to new ideas and new colours. There are various standard rules about colour which it helps to understand, the idea of complementary colours, warm and cool colours. It helps to work from one side to the other, so part of the mobility of allowing one's eye to flow and move freely around the subject is that you need to compare one eye with another eye, one nostril with another nostril, the position of where one ear might be in relation to the other, and move backwards and forwards, up and down, across and around the subject, all the time comparing one position with another and looking, if you can, at the spaces between the features. If you concentrate on painting a head rather than a face and try and capture what will or should happen is that the features accrue, they arrive almost inadvertently as you're painting. We have such enormous preconceptions about faces. There's really no subject on earth about which we have more preconceptions, that part of the trick of painting a portrait successfully is to try somehow to forget that you're painting a face or painting a person, and to treat it as a still life or as a landscape where the objects within the landscape don't have names and don't have characteristics but are simply seen in relation to each other. And so, as with a still life, the intervals and the spaces and the punctuation marks are as important as the eyes and the nose and the mouth and the things that we think of as being the principal features of a face. all the time throughout the process you have to be willing to sacrifice what you've done to radically alter the position of things and the relationship of things. And the joy of oil paint is its mobility and the speed and ease with which you can make dramatic revisions. And amateur painters very often find it very difficult. They cling on to the bits that they feel are working, and by anchoring themselves to the things that are working, they inhibit the progress of the picture and compromise it very dramatically. The palette that I've chosen, by palette I mean the colours that I'm painting with, in this case is relatively simple. The centrepiece of the palette are two colours called light red and cerulean blue. These colours are opposites, or what painters call complementary colours. The test of a complementary colour is that if you mix the two colours together and add white, you get grey. And so by adding a little bit of cerulean blue to light red, I can mute it slightly, take some of the heat out of it, take some of the redness out of it, and the exact opposite is true with the cerulean blue. So once I've got the geography of the face, broadly speaking, where I want it, I'll start to put some slightly thicker, fatter paint onto the picture and start to try and describe the light and the colour that Barbak has in his face. Because it's important to have a variety of marks, I might use a different brush at this stage, or a palette knife. And the joy of using a palette knife obviously is that it's very quick to spread the paint on like butter, but also you can mix up the colour you want in a more precise way on the palette and set up a relationship of colours on the palette. I'm also trying to anchor his head into the background, only in tiny ways, but the horizontal of the shelf that runs behind him and the tonality of the background, where in some areas for example, his hair is dark against the background, whereas his cheek is quite light against the background. Setting up these relationships is incredibly important. Although you don't have to paint a portrait of the things around your sitter, you need to be acutely aware of what they're doing, partly because they inform the subject and partly because they put the figure in context. In a painting of 1 hour, and very often with portraiture, you sort of know how long you're going to have, because you have to have some dialogue with your sitter about how long they're willing to give you. That doesn't mean, of course, that you can't carry on working on the picture without the sitter there, but in a way it's perhaps easier with portraitures to decide when to lay off than it is with a landscape or with a picture where your subject is more permanent. In this instance we have 1 hour, and so the film will stop running at the end of 1 hour and that will be it. But I could of course come back to the picture, I could work on it once the paint has dried. And the key, if you continue with the work, is obviously to try and keep the work fresh, and as I've said before, not to be stuck on certain bits of the picture that you feel protective about, but to be willing to make big changes and big sacrifices in order to keep the picture alive and in order to get yourself closer to the final destination, which must of course be some sort of truth, some sort of representation that captures the topography of the sitter's face, but also the character of your sitter. I think rules and regulations about how to paint are a bad idea. What I'm hoping to do is to give you a few ideas about how to approach the paint, maybe a few ideas about how to set up your subject, but ultimately you have to find your own voice when you're painting. Very few people are born with painting skills, if any, and certainly how to work with colour is very rarely innate. Obviously one needs constantly to take steps back from it, to move away from it, and to try and see it objectively in order to decide whether or not it's time to stop, and obviously to make judgments about whether things can be improved and changed.